Bishop Anthony Fisher was born in Sydney and has attended various Catholic primary schools and completed his secondary education at St Ignatius College at Riverview. At the University of Sydney, he received degrees in history and law before practising law in a city firm. In 1985, Bishop Anthony entered the Dominicans. It's a religious order dedicated to preaching the Catholic faith in the context of a life of study, prayer and community. He studied for the priesthood in Melbourne, receiving an honours degree in theology. And following that, Bishop Anthony completed a doctorate in bioethics at the University of Oxford. From 1995 to 2000, he was a lecturer at the Australian Catholic University. From 2000 to 2003, he was Foundation Director of the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and the Family in Melbourne. And he remains Professor of Moral Theology and Bioethics at the Institute. In 2003, Pope John Paul II appointed him Auxiliary Bishop of Sydney. In that archdiocese, he was Episcopal Vicar for Life and Health and Chairman of the Catholic School. His community involvements have been many. He's been Chaplain to the Parliament of Victoria, member of the Infertility Treatment Authority of Victoria, a chair or member of several hospital ethics committees. He was the coordinator of the very successful World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008. On the 8th of January 2010, Pope Benedict appointed Bishop Anthony the third Bishop of Parramatta. He's also Chairman of the Catholic Education Commission of New South Wales, a member of the Australian Bishops' Commission for Doctrine and Morals, and the Bishops' Commission for Pastoral Life, and the Bishops' Delegate for Youth. Since 2004, he's been an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, a body that advises the Church on bioethics. He recently published Catholic Bioethics for a New Millennium. We have some copies available tonight. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bishop Anthony Fisher.
Same-sex marriage is all the rage at the moment. Last week, the lower house of the Tasmanian Parliament passed a bill to allow it. A similar bill passed first reading stage in the New Zealand Parliament. And the Scots Parliament announced its plans to make a similar law. Meanwhile, on the latest count, there are 4 bills before the Australian Federal Parliament on this matter, 2 in each house. Recent legislation for civil unions in the ACT, ape marriage, and the local Attorney-General openly says it's a stage towards same-sex marriage on the Tasmanian model. So I'm especially grateful to Bill Mason and to Father Julian and all those involved in the Thomas More Forum for inviting me here tonight to speak on this very topical and, in my view, crucial issue. But first, a little history. At 5 a.m. on the 22nd of June, 1535, the Lieutenant of the Tower of London woke a frail old man for his 9 a.m. execution. His response? I'll go back to sleep for a while, as I want to save my strength for the occasion. When the lieutenant returned, just before 9 a.m, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was dressed in his best clothes for what he called his wedding day. From the scaffold, he asked for prayers for the king and country and for himself, and then he was beheaded. His naked body lay there all day until soldiers buried him without rites. His head was impaled on London Bridge, then thrown into the Thames. If such a thing could happen to the greatest churchman in England, no one was safe. Within 3 weeks, his friend, the former Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, met the same fate. He would famously declare, "I am the King's good servant, but God's first." In due course, they would share the same feast day, Fisher's wedding day, the 22nd of June. St Thomas More and St John Fisher. Both were men of prayer and penance, both scholars and administrators, both intellectually sophisticated yet practical men. Though the powers of this world were against them, they remained hopeful to the end. With More telling his judges he hoped they might hereafter in heaven all meet merrily together to our everlasting salvation. Neither man would allow that the church should replace the state or the state the church. Each had its proper place. As the Pope could not determine the laws of England, so the King could not redefine the laws of God. Both men refused to check their beliefs in the cloakroom before entering the university, the parliament, or the public square. As some claimed they should. For people of integrity, such compartmentalising is impossible. But why refuse to take the King's oath when such refusal would mean disgrace, dispossession, decapitation? Why not say whatever is required, but with your fingers crossed, so to speak? God would know where your real loyalties lie. So many advised More and Fisher. But they would not lie, even to save their lives. Never to lie was, they thought, a duty of any officer of the church or the law, of every Christian, and indeed every person. Both believed the King's first marriage was valid. To swear otherwise would be to assert a deliberate falsehood, intending to deceive. That one might face disadvantage, ridicule, even death for standing up for truth and conscience is far from unprecedented. It is the stuff of martyrs and daily Christian heroism. In this Golden Jubilee year, the opening of the Second Vatican Council, there's already been much talk about the Church's famous teaching at the Council on the rights of conscience. What some miss was the Council's unequivocal insistence on the priority of truth. As More and Fisher thought, it's the duty of every person, every Christian, including every lawmaker and churchman, to speak and live by the truth. Conscience shows us how. It's never a route to convenience, evasion, or false witness. What else was at stake for John Fisher and Thomas More? Well, many things, no doubt, but one was the meaning of marriage. Could the state, by a simple act of Parliament, redefine marriage for the convenience of one man, King Henry, or the interests of many? Could it make what is by nature, faith and reason a lifelong commitment something more provisional, at least for the powerful? Or is it the role of law here to recognise an institution that pre-exists it and which is deserving of its support? Such questions echo down the centuries, as some lawmakers now seek to redefine marriage yet again, this time to allow same-sex marriage. And once again, those who dare oppose the mood of the age will be branded bigots, traitors, or worse. Which brings me to part 2. There's 7 if you'd like to count them as we go. That way you can decide when to wake up again or how to pace your saying of the rosary as I go. So 2, marriage as the crunch point for religious liberty. Dan Cathy president of a family-owned business, Chick-fil-A, is a Bible Christian. Unremarkably, you might think, he told a Baptist publication and a Christian radio program that he believes in the biblical definition of the family unit, based on the marriage of a man and a woman. All hell broke loose. Within hours, the fast food chicken chain was being labelled a hate organisation in the media. Its restaurants were spray painted with defamations, and colleges were cancelling them as caterers. The Mayor of Boston, Thomas Menino, said he hoped to ban those restaurants from his city. The Chicago Mayor, Rahm Emanuel, declared that Chick-fil-A values are not Chicago values. And the company that supplied Muppets and other toys for the Chick-fil-A kids' meals cancelled its contract and donated a large sum to the Gay and Lesbian Alliance. This recent incident is not an isolated one. Peter Vidmar, America's most decorated male gymnast, was selected to be the chef de mission of the American team for the 2012 Olympics, where he would have represented all American athletes and marched in the opening ceremonies. But his selection drew criticism from same-sex marriage activists because in 2008 he had publicly supported California's Proposition 8 that defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. He was forced to resign from his Olympic position. A couple of weeks ago, the Wildflower Inn in Lyndonville, Vermont, was forced to pay damages to a lesbian couple for having refused to host their wedding reception there. The inn also had to agree to no longer host any weddings or any wedding receptions on their premises in future. Well, only in America, you might say. Well, after a hockey player made a TV ad in favour of same-sex marriage, a Canadian sportscaster, Damien Goddard, said on Twitter that he supported the traditional and true meaning of marriage. He was quickly fired by his employer, Sportsnet. Like Peter Vidmar, this Canadian learnt the hard way that being pro-marriage and pro-sport don't mix. Across the Atlantic, the Law Society of England and Wales revoked permission for a group called Christian Concern to use its premises, once it realised that the group supported traditional marriage. The Law Society said this was contrary to its diversity policy. British MPs are now threatening to stop churches holding weddings if they do not agree to conduct same-sex ones. In several European countries, state and even church schools must now teach that homosexuality is amongst the range of options for children. Religious leaders, such as the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, have been sacked for daring to differ. In Spain, same-sex lobby groups want to prosecute a bishop for hate speech after he preached in favour of the Catholic teaching on marriage. 3. Not in Australia, surely. Well, when Victoria's Deputy Chief Psychiatrist, Curavilla George, joined 150 other doctors earlier this year, advising a Senate inquiry that children do better with a mum and a dad, committed to each other and to the kids for the long haul. He was pilloried, forced out of his position on the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, and threatened with dismissal from his academic and medical posts. Even Prime Minister Gillard is under attack for agreeing to speak at a Christian conference. Alex Greenwich, the convener of Australian Marriage Equality, claims it's completely inappropriate for our national leader to seem to endorse the views of pro-marriage Christian extremists. Ironically, the Prime Minister's talk will be on the topic religious freedom in a secular democracy. Whether it's restaurateurs, athletes, broadcasters, psychiatrists, school teachers, rabbis, innkeepers, or politicians, no one is exempt from this ferocious campaign to silence advocates of marriage as traditionally understood. The view that marriage is between a man and a woman, which was common to people of every known religion, philosophy and culture in history till now, has suddenly become unspeakable. To achieve this, the same-sex marriage lobby have cleverly shanghaied the language of race equality, repeatedly declaring that marriage redefinition is inevitable, that 8 out of 10 people support the change, and that the opponents have no arguments to offer, only neo-Nazi hatred, or worse, religion. Of course, for now, there will be the outward shows of civil debate and promises of religious exemptions. But it's an open secret amongst same-sex marriage advocates that any such exemptions will be temporary, and that religious organisations will be required to fall into line in due course. Gay rights trump rights of conscience, belief and religious practice every time. 4. What is real marriage? Is the Christian understanding of marriage peculiar to Christian believers? My thought is no and yes. That's a very Dominican answer. No, because marriage is demonstrably a natural institution, found in all religions, cultures and societies over the millennia. In no way the monopoly of those who believe in Christ and the Judeo-Christian revelation. But yes, we do have a particular take on marriage, which makes this debate particularly crucial for us, for reasons I'll outline later. We can, I believe, give good arguments from philosophy, history, social science, law and literature for the classical view of marriage, without appealing to divine revelation. Marriage is a comprehensive union of minds, bodies and wills by two physically and psychologically different beings, each providing something the other lacks, each giving and receiving from the other a new identity as spouse and potential parent. Only a man can enable a woman to become a wife and mother. Only a woman can enable a man to become a husband and father. Only the one flesh union of man and wife can be fertile, so that by strange conjugal mathematics, 1 + 1 = 1, and then 3, 4, and so on. That such an evolving relationship be a lasting one is essential if children are not only to come to be, but also to have the ongoing benefit of a mother and a father. Such a comprehensive union and such dedication to children are secured by a permanent and exclusive commitment of spouses to each other and their family. Put baldly, marriage makes it likelier that kids will be reared by their biological parents. Thus, deliberately short-term, open, child-free or same-sex marriages may be genuine, heartfelt, committed friendships, but they are not true marriages. Only marriage brings and holds together that range of goods that are easily fragmented at high personal and social cost, including sexual difference, love, commitment, sexual activity, procreative activity, mums, dads, and babies. It's this intrinsic link between marriage and family that explains why societies take marriage so seriously. The state doesn't normally get involved in relationship issues. It's not the state's business. It's not up to governments to tell us who our friends should be, or even who we live with. The state isn't there to regulate emotional ties, hopes and promises. It's only because marriage involves so much more than emotional ties, and especially the having and rearing of children, that governments ever got involved in recognising, regulating and supporting marriages. 5. Tinkering with marriage. Of course, the tinkering with marriage is not new. Every culture in history has recognised that marriage is the proper home for sex. Yet for a few decades now, many have treated sex as a recreational activity rather than a conjugal one. Every culture in history has recognised that marriage is the nursery of family. Yet many now render their sexual activity sterile, having sex without babies and marriages without babies. Every culture in history has recognised that marriage is a lifelong union. Yet our laws now allow divorce on demand, no reasons given, after only 1 year. Every culture in history has recognised that marriage is a solemn vow and sacred state. Yet many now demean it with try before you buy cohabitation, even though this radically reduces marital sticking power, and then marry without sacred rites. Now the social engineers have their sights set on removing the man and woman part of marriage as well. All that will be left is marriage as an emotional union. It's enough, as they say, that people love each other. If marriage is just about feelings and promises, it obviously can't be limited to a man and a woman. 2 men or 2 women might love each other. But on the same logic, so might more than 2. Same-sex marriage advocates say talk of polygamy is scaremongering, but they give no principled reason for excluding it. Indeed, this very week, a 3-person partnership of a man and 2 women was registered under Brazil's civil union law, introduced to accommodate same-sex marriage advocates. A public official explained that the concepts of marriage and family have now morphed to allow recognition of such novel arrangements. If polygamy is irresistible on the all that matters is that they love each other line, so is marriage between siblings or between a parent and their adult child. Once again, this is not just slippery slope pessimism. It simply reflects the fact that the advocates of same-sex marriage give no account of marriage that would exclude such intimate partnerships from being deemed marriages. Only marriage, understood as the kind of comprehensive union I've outlined earlier in this talk, can resist such morphing. So too, proposals that 2 or more people who love each other and want to marry for, say, 10 years with an option for renewal. Many today think like Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass, who said, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Marriage is whatever we make it." 6. Justice and discrimination. To contend otherwise, that marriage has an intrinsic meaning, and that this includes being the union of a man and a woman, is not, as those trying to bully us into silence suggest, homophobia. Many of us know and care about people with same-sex attractions, and we wish the best for them. Nor is this about unjust discrimination. Though no one would pretend that the record of Christians has been perfect through the ages, Christians rightly deplore injustices perpetrated upon people because of religion, sex, race, sexuality, and so on. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, for instance, calls for understanding for those with deep-seated homosexual tendencies. And here I'm quoting the Catechism: "They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided." But not every difference of treatment is unjust discrimination. Only women are admitted to women's hospitals. Only children to primary schools. Programs target Aborigines, refugees, those with disabilities, those with reading disorders, and so on. Privileging or assisting particular people in relevant ways is not arbitrary, but an entirely fair response. What justice requires is that we treat people alike unless there is a relevant difference. So if an institution is designed to support people of opposite sex to be faithful to each other and to the children of their union, it's not discrimination to reserve that institution to them. It would be unjust to pretend that those who cannot offer each other sexual complementarity and cannot engage in conjugal acts are married. A second injustice, a grave one, is to put the wishes of adults before the needs of children, ignoring the importance for kids of having, as far as possible, a mum and a dad committed to them and to each other for the long haul. Some admit the overwhelming evidence that children suffer disadvantage from solo parenting, but argue that as long as there are two parents, it doesn't matter what sex they are. A 2005 brief of the pro-same-sex marriage and pro-same-sex adoption American Psychological Association is often cited in support of that thesis. But when Lauren Marks recently reviewed the 59 studies referred to in that brief for the journal Social Science Research, she found that the report relied entirely on statistically insignificant studies. A second article in the same journal by University of Texas sociologist Mark Regnerus reviewed more recent, more extensive empirical evidence and found that children raised by same-sex couples did not, on average, fare as well emotionally and socially as those raised by their married biological mother and father. Predictably, he was immediately tagged anti-gay and victimised by the media and the Academy for publishing these findings. To experiment with family structures by calling same-sex relationships marriages and then basing families on them is experimenting upon children. And this is seriously unjust, even if it's approved by various elites. A third injustice is in further destabilising the institution of marriage itself, and thus the individual instances of it, at a time when marriages are already under considerable pressure and there is much confusion about what marriage means and how to live it well. Further undermining public understanding of this institution is likely further to undermine the viability of many marriages and much needed social support for real marriages. A fourth injustice of the same-sex marriage proposal is its retrospectivity. Redefining marriage tells those already married that they got married on a false premise, that they were wrong to think they were entering a lifelong and exclusive partnership of a man and a woman open to raising children, that the meaning of their vows is now changed by law to being merely about loving each other for as long as it lasts. That would be unjust to the many people already married and those who might like to enter a real marriage in the future. Which brings me to part 7. I said earlier that I thought the case for real marriage can be made on the basis of common sense or natural reason, and thus philosophy, history, social science and so on, without appeal to divine revelation, the Bible or Christian tradition. And that's what I've been doing in the first 6 parts of this talk. But in this last part, I'd like to suggest that Christians do have a particular stake in this debate, and that this brings me back to the patron of this forum, St. Thomas More, who was martyred in part for his defence of marriage. Why are Christians so concerned about legal definitions of marriage? Couldn't they leave this to the state and make their own private ritual arrangements with respect to matrimony? Well, one reason I think they resist this is that Christianity has always been a particularly pro-marriage, pro-family religion. And that goes back to Jesus' own strong positions in support of marriage, women and children. Our religious tradition describes marriage as a man leaving his father and mother to join his wife, so that the two become one. A description we find as early as the book of Genesis, as late as Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and confirmed conclusively by Christ in the Gospels. As John the Baptist suffered martyrdom for objecting to Herod's incestuous marriage, so Thomas More stands in a long line of Christians who've been instinctively protective of an institution not only natural to human beings, but divinely instituted for their flourishing as disciples. Secondly, Christianity is an incarnational religion. Its God, and so its faith, take flesh amidst marriage, family, politics, and every human reality. This is not to deny a proper autonomy for different realms of life, or a healthy separation of church and state rightly understood. But Christians cannot vacate the public square as some would wish, retreating to ghettos of the like-minded and leaving the rest to their own devices. Husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, and especially children, matter too much for Christians to abandon them and the institution that supports them to opinion polls and power elites. And if Christians themselves are to live their ideals for marriage and family well, they need a supportive cultural context. Thomas More and John Fisher clearly understood this. In resisting the redefinition of marriage for one king or for a small group, they knew they were protecting marriage for the great bulk of people. Thirdly, in the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, we often view our relationship with God through the prism of marriage. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is like a husband and father to Israel. Though Israel sometimes behaves as a harlot, God is always faithful, wooing her back, pledging himself to her and making the union fruitful. In the New Testament, Jesus asks, "How shall I describe the kingdom of God?" It's like a marriage reception, at which he is the bridegroom. So too Paul, when describing Christ's relationship to the church, used a conjugal analogy. Such imagery powerfully indicates the intimacy, permanence, and fidelity of Christ's love, and the seriousness of our fidelity or infidelity to him. But to work, the marriage analogy also requires a genuine otherness between the parties. If they are the same in all relevant respects, then marriage fails as an analogy for the relationship between God and man, Christ and the church. To lose our sense of real marriage, then, as Christians, is to reduce the mystical language by which we can speak of God. Fourthly, as my opening examples demonstrated, there is every reason to think that same-sex marriage will come at a real cost to our religious liberty. Enormous pressures will be brought to bear to teach children in Christian schools that same-sex marriages are the equal of real marriages, and thus that homosexual acts are the equal of conjugal ones. Likewise, Christian organisations will be coerced to employ people in same-sex marriages and extend to them identical benefits to those in real marriages. To conduct same-sex weddings on church premises with church ministers and rites. To offer children for adoption by same-sex couples, and so on. Which brings me to my conclusion. There is a truth about marriage, deep in the heart of every human person, and a wisdom about marriage shared by people of faith. Now more than ever, we must proclaim it with clarity and charity, as St. Thomas More did. To say that redefining marriage won't affect our community's understanding of marriage is a lie we must resist. So too the pressures to bully us into silence. The fact is, there's nothing inevitable about same-sex marriage. Human freedom is the perpetual foil of all inevitability theses, a lesson the Marxists had to learn the hard way. The future is the product of human deliberation and choice, what we make, under divine grace, in and through our individual and common actions. So can we together turn this thing around? By God's grace, I believe we can. Mercifully, none of us here tonight needs fear losing his head for standing up for the truth about marriage. But we'd be naive to think that freedom of belief is always respected in this country and always will be. We must be vigilant. We must be clear and forthright about what is true, if compassionate and humble also when expressing ourselves. Whether or not we are called by God to marry someone, all of us will one day have, like John Fisher did, our own wedding day, when we must say "I do" to truth or falsity, when we must choose between the true and the comfortable, when we must vow ourselves to Christ or something less. St. Thomas More, pray for us, that we too might be the King's good servants, but God's first. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Anthony, for a wonderful thought-provoking address. We'll now move to questions. We have one, Alice, we have one in the front row here. Alice? Question from Michael Jarvis. Seems to me that under the guise of treating those who want to be in same-sex relationships have in fact not treated those who are in traditional opposite-sex marriages equally, but have discriminated against them. What is the motivation of this when the term same-sex unions with equal rights to ordinary marriage would suffice?
I suppose the first thing I'd say is I think you're right that it does discriminate against the vast bulk of married people and those that might want to enter into a real marriage. And I gave 4 arguments for that tonight, and there would be other ones, I'm sure. Do those that are promoting same-sex marriage wish to discriminate? Is it out of a kind of malice? I don't know what the motives in each man's heart or each woman's heart are. But my guess is, for many, it's not out of a kind of malice towards the institution of marriage or towards married people or towards those who might want a real marriage. I think very often it's about other things, like a long history of real or perceived bigotry, discrimination, hatred, self-hatred, that has left people feeling that all sorts of things about our society are the cause, and if we can break those down one by one, we'll create a society where people will feel safer, reverenced, as they should be, and so on. And I think in some people's mind, marriage is seen as one of those last bastions of that old world that hurt us. And if we can break that down, we'll have a better world where we'll be loved and respected appropriately. And I think we have to take that seriously, that motivation seriously. We have to both accept the implicit criticism that sometimes the church, Christians, lawmakers and so on have, in various ways, hurt people by a lack of regard for their needs or for what justice requires. And I think we have to say, well, what's the real problem here that we could be addressing? And are there other ways to address it? For instance, people say, well, I love my same-sex partner, and yet if he goes to hospital or she goes to hospital, I won't have the same rights to visit her in hospital, even though we care for each other day after day. Well, can't we address that problem directly? And in fact, we've tried to do so legally. You don't have to change the institution of marriage to address that problem. Or people will say there are young people who suffer great depression or self-hatred because they believe they are homosexual or lesbian, they have a same-sex attraction, they think that's permanent. How do we deal with their depression or self-hatred? Well, change marriage. No, I'd say we've got to move in and show them that they are loved and that they are equally regarded by us and by everybody, and that Christ loves them and his church loves them. That's the way to help people with depression or self-hatred, rather than to mess with marriage. So my thought is here, it's not about malice, but it's about a misconception of how you might address certain perceived and sometimes real hurts that people have suffered. I think that's what's driving this. It's my sense of it anyway.
Thank you. Paul Goon asked this question. Why is it that one group can claim another group's ideas are discriminatory, but their own ideas do not discriminate against that group?
Yeah. Well, I've proposed tonight why I think it is, it's a misunderstanding of justice and discrimination to characterise defenders of real marriage, of the traditional conception of marriage, as somehow bigots or prejudiced or discriminatory, and those who defend a reinvention or morphing of marriage as somehow the enlightened, just, fair-minded people. It's simply a rhetorical tactic by those who want to get their way on this issue. But I think what they're playing on, and this is quite powerful, and I hinted of this in the talk, is that there's something similar here to racism. Now, there was a time when people said blacks and whites shouldn't be allowed to marry. Out of pure racism, a view that somehow blacks weren't human or weren't fully or equally human or whatever. And there were parts of the world where that was actually illegal, like some states of the United States. And the thought here is, or the emotion here is, this is the same. It's like that. It's treating people who are equal in every relevant respect as unequal and refusing them certain privileges or supports. And I think, again, we have to understand that emotion and be wary of that rhetoric and be ready to answer it by showing that what we're doing is proposing is entirely just and not driven by any hatred for one group or another or any view of inferiority and superiority. That this really is about reverence for every human being and for the family life that every human being could have and should have.
Thank you. Lara Kirk from Lauren Bateman asks this question. How far should the removal of unjust discrimination go? For example, superannuation provisions next to kid rights in medical decisions. When does the removal of discrimination become compromise?
I think this is a genuinely very hard question, which I don't have a simple answer because I think this is essentially a prudential question, which people of sound reasoning and good heart, goodwill, could come to a different view. But I'm wary of the view that we should abolish in law all differences between marriages and other relationships in terms of how they're regarded and supported and privileged, apart from the word marriage. And that's been the trend in some places, to say, well, we will concede to other relationships, such as same-sex ones, all the same significance, privileges, supports that we give to marriages. Where, if I'm right about the importance of marriage as an institution that supports couples of opposite sex and the children that naturally result from their partnership, it's trying to support that and the permanence of that relationship, above all because of how important it is for the children, then it may be entirely reasonable to give that some extra helps. To say, well, we're going to have certain tax breaks or other things for that relationship. And it's not out of a prejudice or homophobia or hatred or anything else that we don't give exactly the same supports to every other kind of friendship. We just say, this one needs some special help. As I said before, we have women's hospitals for women. It's not because we hate men, it's because there are certain issues best addressed in a specialist hospital or clinic. And so likewise, I think it could be that some things, whether it's in the area of superannuation or property or other ones, that there are tax laws and so on where we do rightly give some special help to marriage, particularly in the current circumstances where so many marriages are suffering. And so I'm wary, as I think Lara might be, of the view that says treat all friendships the same and have no differences in terms of any of those social conventions or policies. But exactly which ones, I think we could have a long debate tonight, because clearly some of them should be, for instance, I think the right of two maiden aunts who normally look after each other at home, possibly for 50 years, to visit each other when one goes to hospital. I think it is common sense to anybody that should, as it were, extend beyond marriage to other kinds of friendships. So certainly some of the rights and supports we give to marriage would also properly be given to other friendships. But what things you might still want to do to support marriage in particular is something, I think, for particular societies to work out at particular times.
Howard Murray from Fadden poses this question. Would you please explain how a state government can legislate for marriage in apparent contravention of the Marriage Act?
Well, look, we've all got shameful things in our past, and one of mine is that I was a lawyer, but I repented, and so there'd be others in this room that could answer that question better than I. But as a bush lawyer, let me say it seems very clear to me the marriage power is one conceded under our Constitution to the Commonwealth Government, and that state and territory governments have no power to legislate contrary to Commonwealth law in this area. Now, the Commonwealth could, in certain circumstances, vacate the field and leave it to existing state laws just by negligence or inaction or whatever. But it hasn't done that, quite the contrary. 8 years ago, and a little more, we actually made very clear in our statute law what the definition of marriage was in Australia. That stands. And until such time as that changes, I can't see how any state or territory could make a contrary law on the definition of marriage. So that means very possibly that in Tasmania, for instance, as soon as that bill passes the upper house, if it does, and we should not accept it's inevitable, but if it does, that it would be contested immediately in the High Court by somebody. Even if the Attorney-General of Tasmania is unlikely to bring the action, somebody else will, such as, I'd hope, the Federal Attorney-General. And if that was heard, I think that law would be struck down. That's my guess as a bush lawyer, but then there may be some constitutional lawyer here that will tell us something to the contrary, that the states still have some remnant power in the marriage area. I mean, they still do the registration of marriages, for instance, as they do of deaths and births. But I don't think Tasmania can make a law contrary to the federal law in this matter. New Zealand can, because it doesn't have the benefit of being part of the Commonwealth of Australia as yet.
Okay, Kevin Condon from Oxley asks, how effective do you think the Australian Christian lobby is in opposing same-sex marriage? And we're pleased to see the ACL represented here tonight.
I think it's terribly important that Christians not let this issue be sectarianised, so not let it be written off, as so often happens, as a Catholic thing, so you can then feed on traditional anti-Catholicism as a way of killing particular positions or arguments. So I think it's hugely helpful that Christians stand together on this, because there's clearly an issue on which we have enormous common ground. And so I'm delighted that the Australian Christian lobby, which includes Catholics of course, but also includes many other kinds of evangelical and Pentecostal Christians, Bible Christians, and others that support it. I think probably all sorts of people support it come election time and other times, that they speak out, and it's not just left to Catholic bishops and and Catholic faithful on this matter. Different people have different views on what our rhetoric should be, what our ads should look like, what our pamphlet should look like, whatever. And that's fine, I'd say. I'm not one to regularly to quote Mao, but let 1,000 flowers bloom on this matter. But I think it's great that on this issue Christians are working together, and I wish we'd do it on a lot more things.
This is a related question from Doug Hutchison from Goulburn. Anglicare in Canberra Goulburn has already introduced equal opportunity regulation to allow for same-sex relationships as being equal in relationship towards adoption and foster care activity. How do Catholics answer the divergence between Catholics and other Christian denominations in this area?
Well, it's a pity. It's a pity. I think Christians should stand firm on their understanding of marriage and the family, and stand firm together and help to give a lead in our community, and not bow to the pressure. The pressures are huge. I mean, we've now had in Britain, the churches have basically had to get out of the adoption business. In Massachusetts state, the Catholic adoption service was effectively closed down by the state legislature because it refused to do same-sex adoption. So the pressures are huge, and I can understand agencies that say, well, no, for all the good we do in lots of other areas, we will give in on this in order to do that. I well understand the pressures, and I well understand the complicated cases at the edges, like the husband and wife who break up and one of them goes into a same-sex marriage, and that's the one that's got the care of the kid for whatever reason, and you want the partner to somehow be a guardian or whatever, and you want that to be somehow legally recognised. But again, I think surely there are ways of doing that without changing the definition of marriage or of family, or radically changing the adoption laws, or church agencies becoming part of that social experiment. But I don't know the details of what's happened in this diocese or in other churches, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Lyle Nunn from Everton. One of the difficulties in clarifying the relationship between Christian, that is sacramental and natural law ideas of marriage. So it would be good to say that the Marriage Act definition was not just Christian, but the patriarchs of the
Old Testament
practiced polygamy, and Moses allowed the Jews divorce because of the hardness of their hearts. Were their marriages not even natural law marriages, or has Christ redefined natural law marriages?
Now we're entering some deep water, aren't we?
Getting better.
There's no doubt at different times, different cultures have diverted from that initial picture of marriage that we get in Genesis, of the man and wife. We're told leaving mother and father. Well, Adam and Eve didn't have a mother and father to leave, but everyone else has had since. And uniting as one flesh and becoming then the basis of family, so that we have multiply and fill the earth. Now that picture of marriage we see as the Old Testament goes on breaks down in all sorts of ways. There's prostitution, there's Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, I think you find. He was quite a man. And there was, as we just heard, divorce was allowed. Divorce was allowed especially to men. Women didn't have much in the way of rights to divorce, but men did, largely at will, in due course, as things were corrupted. And clearly, part of the prophetic tradition was to call people back to the ideals. And so we hear the prophets say, God hates divorce. So even while the Mosaic law and the customs of Israel were allowing more and more of these things, the prophets were calling people back to the original ideals. And clearly, come Christ, it's very clear where God stands on marriage. Now, we recognise that it doesn't always work out. Now, one way or another, civil law has to deal with that and has to work out, well, who custody and property and all sorts of things around that. But in terms of the notion of what marriage is, I think that one is consistently known across cultures, and people recognise when it's been corrupted, when it's not being lived well. I don't think anyone in Israel pretended that Solomon's having 700 wives and 300 concubines and no one knew how many children, or that men divorcing possibly multiple wives multiple times and just casting off the women, that was either what marriage really meant philosophically, in natural law terms, or what was God's will for the human person, human relationships. People even then knew it was corrupt, and the prophets and ultimately Jesus Christ made that absolutely clear.
Thank you. Greg from Farrer, what part in same-sex marriage has contraception played in its development and spread?
Well, that's an interesting question. You recall there in one part of the paper I talked about different ways we've been tinkering with marriage, really since the sexual revolution. And one of them, I said no, one of them was that marriage was always regarded as the place for sex, the home for sex. And now it's for anybody and everybody and everywhere. A second I said was it was always known as the nursery, understood to be the nursery for children. And yet, since the sexual revolution, there have been people who have said, oh, well, it's an optional extra whether you can be married, and then it's an optional extra whether you have children. Depends on, once you've got the house and the cars and the big TV and all, had the trips and so on, you might then want a child for the couple who've had everything else. Only one child, or what it is now, 1.7 or whatever children. Clearly, that revolution has in all sorts of ways already damaged marriage and our conceptions of marriage and our ability to live marriage well. And I named a number of parts to this, and the sexual revolution, the contraceptive and abortion revolution is part of that. Unpicking of marriage, so unpicking of the understanding of the natural and proper relationship between life and love, between commitment to each other and commitment to a future generation. Do you say then, well, it's hopeless? They've been unpicking it for 50 years, it's hopeless. Or do we say, well, we hold on to what we've still got that's good and try and rebuild on that? And that's what I'd be saying again. As I said at the end, there's nothing inevitable about, there's been a slide in the understanding of marriage, the ability of the people to live marriage well, so we give up. I'd say rather, well, we hold on to the fact that most people deep down still have higher aspirations for marriage than elements of contemporary culture would propose to them. Most people deep down still want more for marriage. You ask any young couple who are in love and wanting to get married, they have very high ideals for marriage. That's still deep in the human heart, and we call people back to that rather than giving up because people have been deconstructing marriage for 50 years now.
Thank you. Patrick Jones from Griffith, regular attendee of these forums. We all know that Rome thinks not in terms of years, decades or centuries, but in terms of millennia. It's nearly 1,000 years since the Pope ruled on celibacy for the ordained. Is it time for change? What do you think?
Well, I don't think it's got anything immediately to do with same-sex marriage, but I think, in fact, perhaps if I could just question a historical premise in there, and that was that kind of celibacy was invented around 1000 AD and imposed by a pope. I mean, it's pretty clear that Jesus was celibate and that Paul was celibate, and that Paul commends that state, and that Jesus commends that state as given to some. So it's not invented about 1000 AD. It's there already in the first century in Christ's teaching, in St Paul's teaching. And it was practiced by some Christians from very early, and there's plenty of historical evidence for that. Now, when it became the only way to be a priest, happened at different times in different parts of the church. So some parts of the church embraced celibacy as the norm quite early, and others took longer, and some never did, or did for a time and then had married clergy later. So just a bit of a question there about the history. It's not so late as you often hear it proposed, that some pope got up one morning and after a bad breakfast or something decided to invent celibacy and impose it on priests and nuns. I think there are enormous spiritual strengths in men and women being so single-mindedly devoted to Christ and his people, and that celibacy supports that. I recognise also we have in the Eastern Church, we have in some of the convert clerics, we have in some of our sister denominations, married clergy. We have precedents for it in our history, even in the Western Church. So I'm not saying this is an impossible thing, but I do think there are huge spiritual strengths for our church in the celibate clergy and religious. And I would say it's fascinating to me that when priests and religious fail to live those ideals, and they've failed spectacularly in some cases in the last few decades, to the great shame of the church, including its leaders. But when that happens, people are still disappointed. People still think more is possible and could be and should be. So that deep down they know there's something about this that is about celibacy that is good and worthy of attempting, and therefore to be disappointed about the failure of. And that I think tells us something, that even the most hostile, the Canberra Times seems to be appalled when priests fail to live their vows of celibacy. Well, maybe because it's deep down they know there's something beautiful there that should be happening and isn't that disappointing to everybody, even people that don't like the Catholic thing much.
Thank you. George Burke, Queanbeyan. Where do you see annulment as opposed to divorce, where marriage is defined as a union of a man and a woman for life?
I think we have to be very clear that annulment is not Catholic divorce. Lots of people talk that way, think that way. It's got nothing to do with divorce. It can look like divorce because usually people get civilly divorced first and then get annulled. And it seems to have many of the same consequences in terms of separation and freedom to remarry and the effects on children and property and surnames and all sorts of things. And we've got Father Julian here, so he can explain. We've got Sister Elizabeth. There's 10 times more expertise in this room about canon law than I've got in my little head. But what annulment is about is saying some weddings are not marriages. Some people go through all the outward forms of marriage. It looks like marriage. It looks to all the world like marriage from the outside. They might have gone into it with the best will in the world, but something very important was missing. That meant there was no real marriage, despite all the appearances. And I would say, amongst the things that would be an immediate ground for annulling a marriage, one would be that it turns out that both of them were men. Both of them were women. Now, of course, no one's going to go to seek annulment for that, because no one's going to pretend, I would hope, that was a Catholic marriage and a Christian marriage in the first place. But that's an example. There are many other things that could be missing. That means, despite the outward appearances of the wedding ceremony and of living as husband and wife, something radically important was actually missing from the beginning. So there was a wedding but no marriage.
Thank you. We have 2 questions left. I'd like to apologise. There's 2 or 3 other questions that I just can't quite read it clearly. But we're also running out of time, and we're hitting about a dozen questions. We always line up before 9 o'clock. So there's just 2 questions we have time to answer, to put. Frank Lyons from Nichols. What happened to the concept of sexual continence?
Well, I've talked a bit about celibacy already. We could also talk about chastity, and we could talk about continence. Clearly, on the Christian view of things, marriage is the home of sexual activity. Sexual activity says marriage. It says what marriage says. It says, I give you myself completely, all that I am. I give you myself and I receive you, all that you are. It says what marriage says. And for everyone else, it would be a lie. For everyone who was not married, it would be a lie. To say that with your body when you're not saying that with your mind and your will, when you're not saying that by marrying the person. And that means for everyone else, we have to find, and that's actually probably most of humanity at any particular time, because a lot of humanity are under the age of marriage, or they're widows, or they're priests and nuns, or they're not found a spouse yet, or whatever. For a lot of humanity anyway, at any one time, we have to find other ways of being loving, of being intimate, of being warm, not becoming cold, repressed, cranky, whatever. We have to find ways of being all those good things so that our sexual continence, our sexual inactivity, is expressing our true self. It's part of telling the true story of me, telling the truth about me. And that's not repression or being a caged animal or being frigid or something. That's about putting sexuality at the service of my vocation, putting it in its place so it tells the truth about me and about my relationships. And for many of us, that means being sexually continent, inactive, possibly for a long time, in some cases for life.
The final question, which has a slightly different tack from Frank Wong. You were at a Jesuit school but chose the Dominicans. Can you explain the different charisms of these 2 great orders?
Again, I don't think this bears very immediately on the issue of same-sex marriage. Jesuits had a huge influence on me because I was Jesuit educated for 6 years, and some of the priests I hugely admire to this day, and they were a big influence on my vocation. But different orders have a different mission given them by the church, and especially by their founder, and a different way of living their religious life. Dominicans are more monkish, so you see I look more monkish than the average Jesuit. We properly live in communities. Most of my Dominican life I lived in communities of about 20. And we pray in community. Ideally, we sing our prayers in community like monks do. Jesuits don't do those things at all. Sometimes they live together, but even then, it's not the same notion of community, because part of Ignatius's genius, as I understand it, was to give men a certain self-sufficiency. So like that, he could send them anywhere in the world to a mission, and they wouldn't be emotionally needy about having a community to support them in their prayer. So, for instance, Dominicans ideally sing the Divine Office several times a day. Jesuits, I think, still are forbidden by their law to pray the office together. They're supposed to say it separately. It's about being spiritually self-sufficient. And these are different ways of then serving the church and building up the kingdom of God. So some will be at home singing their prayers and go out from time to time on the road to preach, which was the Dominican thing. and others will be ready to go to Paraguay to be martyred or whatever like that at the direction of their superiors. And, there are lots of commonalities between these two great orders. They're both intellectual orders. Historically, they've had many great scholar saints. They've helped to serve the intellectual, the theological life of the church, to teach and to preach. But there are differences in the way they live those missions and the way they're supported at home, as it were, in their lifestyle.